A storm brews. The small-town police precinct buzzed with its usual mix of monotony and tension. Officer Mike Harrow sat at his desk, his posture slouched and his expression smug. To him, this was just another day of maintaining his self-appointed order in the town. Known for his brash demeanor and deeply ingrained prejudices, Harrow's presence was both feared and resented by many, though few dared to challenge him outright. Grace Patterson walked into the precinct with purpose. At 72, her frame was slightly stooped, but her resolve was as unyielding as ever. She had spent her life standing tall against injustice, whether it was organizing protests in her neighborhood or mentoring young activists. Today, however, her mission was straightforward: to report the theft of a small but deeply personal family heirloom, a brooch passed down through generations. The precinct's air seemed to grow heavier as Grace approached the front desk. Harrow noticed her immediately. The look of disdain that crossed his face was unmistakable. She didn't belong here, in his eyes, not in his precinct. Grace felt his gaze but refused to flinch. Instead, she calmly approached and cleared her throat. "Good afternoon, officer," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here to report a theft." Harrow didn't bother looking up from the paperwork he was pretending to review. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "What kind of theft, lady? Don't think we got time for lost knitting needles," he sneered, his words oozing condescension. Grace's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "My grandmother's brooch was stolen from my home. It's valuable to my family, both sentimentally and financially." Harrow finally glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "And what makes you think we're gonna waste resources looking for your trinket?" The room seemed to shrink as his words hung in the air. A few officers shifted uncomfortably at their desks, but no one spoke. Grace stood her ground. "Because it's my right as a citizen to report a crime," she replied, her voice unshaken. Harrow's smirk widened. He reached for his coffee cup, the steam rising ominously from its surface. Without breaking eye contact, he tilted the cup and flung its contents across the desk. The scalding liquid splashed onto Grace's face, making her gasp in pain and shock. The room fell silent. Gasps echoed from a few witnesses, their eyes darting between Grace and Harrow. Some officers froze in their seats, while others quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their work. Harrow leaned back, folding his arms smugly. "Consider that a reminder of where you stand," he said coldly. Grace's hand trembled as she reached for a tissue in her bag. The hot coffee stung her skin, but it was the sheer audacity of Harrow's actions that cut deeper. She dabbed her face gently, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she felt. The young officer expected her to crumble, to slink away in silence. But Grace was made of sterner stuff. She straightened her back, meeting Harrow's gaze with steel in her eyes. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice calm and unwavering. Harrow snorted. "Yeah, we'll see about that." With that, Grace turned on her heel and walked out of the precinct. The murmur of whispers followed her as she exited, but no one dared to stop her or intervene. Outside, the crisp autumn air cooled her burning skin, but her heart was ablaze. She wasn't just angry, she was resolute. She had fought bigger battles than this in her lifetime, and she wasn't about to let a small-minded man like Harrow go unchecked. What Harrow didn't know was that Grace Patterson wasn't just an elderly woman seeking justice. She was the grandmother of Elena Patterson, a woman whose name was about to shake the foundations of the very department Harrow thought he ruled. Elena, a brilliant lawyer and trailblazing advocate, had recently been announced as the incoming chief of police for the town, a decision that had already stirred whispers and controversy within the force. Back at home, Grace gently cleaned her face, applying a soothing ointment to the red marks left by the coffee. As she worked, she called Elena, her granddaughter, and recounted the day's events. Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words carried a quiet fury. Elena listened in silence, her grip tightening on the phone. When Grace finished, Elena's voice was steady but filled with determination. "Grandma, I'll handle this. You've done enough for now. Just rest. Grace smiled faintly. I know you will. But remember, Elena, this isn't just about me. It's about the kind of world we're building for everyone. Elena nodded on the other end of the line, even though Grace couldn't see her. I'll make sure of it. The next morning, Elena stepped into the precinct, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. At 38, she exuded confidence and authority, her tailored suit and polished demeanor marking her as a woman who demanded respect. The officers who had ignored Grace the previous day now straightened in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Harrow was leaning against a file cabinet when he spotted Elena. He straightened slightly, his smirk returning as he sauntered over. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he drawled, his tone dripping with insincerity. Elena didn't flinch. She fixed him with a cold stare. "I'm Elena Patterson, your new chief of police." The color drained from Harrow's face. The murmurs in the room grew louder as officers exchanged glances. Elena let the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "I've already reviewed reports of conduct in this precinct," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "But yesterday one incident stood out. An elderly woman was assaulted by an officer. That woman was my grandmother." Harrow opened his mouth to speak, but Elena cut him off. "Save your excuses. I've already spoken with witnesses and reviewed the security footage. Consider this your formal notice. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The room was deathly silent as Harrow sputtered, searching for words. But there was nothing he could say to undo the damage he'd done. Elena turned to address the rest of the precinct. "This department has operated under a culture of impunity for too long. That ends today. We will rebuild this precinct to serve the community with integrity and respect. Anyone unwilling to uphold those values is welcome to resign now." As Elena's words echoed through the room, Grace Patterson sat at home, sipping tea. Her face still bore faint marks from the coffee, but her spirit was unbroken. She knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but with Elena leading the charge, she felt hope rekindled. The storm brewing in the precinct was only the beginning of a larger reckoning, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of that small-town police station. Shadows of the past. Elena Patterson had always known her journey to leadership would be fraught with challenges. As she sat in her new office at the precinct, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint scent of old wood, she couldn't help but reflect on how her grandmother's ordeal had thrust her into the spotlight far sooner than she had anticipated. She had spent her life working against systems of inequity. But now, those systems were no longer distant institutions. They were the very walls she had been tasked to reform. The file in front of her bore the name Officer Mike Harrow. It was thicker than she had expected. Pages of complaints, minor infractions, and troubling incidents spanned his years at the precinct. Each sheet of paper told the same story. A man who believed his badge was a shield for cruelty and a weapon for prejudice. Harrow had been protected by the culture of silence that permeated the precinct, a culture Elena had vowed to dismantle. As she flipped through the pages, a knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Detective Marcus O'Brien, one of the few officers she trusted. A tall man with sharp features and a reputation for fairness, Marcus had been a silent observer of the precinct's dysfunction for years. Elena had already decided to make him a key ally in her efforts to rebuild. "Chief Patterson," Marcus began, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I thought you'd want to see this." He handed her a small flash drive. "What's on it?" Elena asked, inserting the drive into her computer. "Footage from the station's security cameras," Marcus replied. "It's the incident with your grandmother. But there's more. I started digging after what happened yesterday. Harrow's behavior wasn't an isolated event." The video began to play. Elena's jaw tightened as she watched her grandmother enter the station, calm and dignified, only to be met with Harrow's sneers. The moment the coffee splashed across Grace's face, Elena paused the video, her hand hovering over the mouse. "What else did you find?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Marcus hesitated. There's footage from a few months ago. Harrow detained a young man. No real charges, just suspicion. The kid was terrified. And Harrow, well, he went too far. Elena pressed play on the next clip. The scene unfolded with chilling clarity. A young black man in his early 20s, visibly shaken, sat in an interrogation room. Harrow's voice could be heard, sharp and menacing, as he hurled accusations and insults. The young man's attempts to defend himself were met with escalating aggression until Harrow slammed his fist onto the table, sending a cup of water spilling onto the floor. Elena stopped the video and leaned back in her chair. "Why hasn't this been addressed?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus sighed. The precinct's leadership has always looked the other way. Harrow's good at covering his tracks, and most of the officers here either support him or are too afraid to speak out. Elena's eyes narrowed. Not anymore. That evening, Elena visited her grandmother. Grace's small house was a warm refuge, filled with photographs and mementos from a lifetime of activism. The smell of lavender and the soft glow of lamplight greeted Elena as she stepped inside. "You look tired, dear," Grace said, ushering Elena to the couch. "Have you eaten?" Elena smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Grandma. Just busy." Grace poured her a cup of tea, her movements deliberate and calming. "Busy is good, but don't let it wear you down. You have to take care of yourself if you're going to take care of others." Elena took a sip of tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. "I watched the footage," she said quietly. Grace's expression softened, and, "Harrow's worse than I thought. There's a pattern of abuse. He's been protected by this precinct for years, but I'm going to change that." Grace reached out and placed a hand on Elena's. "Change takes time, Elena, and courage. You have both, but you'll need to be careful. Men like Harrow don't let go of their power easily." Elena nodded. "I know, but I've fought for this my entire life. I won't stop now." The next morning, Elena called a meeting with the precinct's officers. The room was filled with a mix of curiosity, resentment, and apprehension. Harrow, still smug despite his suspension, stood near the back, his arms crossed. Elena stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding. "Good morning," she began. "As you all know, I've been appointed as your new chief of police. My goal is to rebuild this precinct into one that serves the community with integrity and respect. To do that, we need to address the culture that's taken root here." Murmurs spread through the room. Harrow's smirk widened, as if daring her to continue. "I've already started reviewing complaints and incident reports," Elena continued. "And what I found is deeply troubling. There is a pattern of misconduct that has gone unchecked for far too long. That ends now." She turned to face Harrow directly. "Officer Harrow, you are under investigation for multiple incidents of abuse of power and misconduct. Effective immediately, you are barred from entering this precinct or contacting any officers pending the outcome of this investigation." Harrow stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't just." "I can and I have," Elena interrupted, her voice steady. "Your actions have consequences, Officer Harrow. You'll have the opportunity to respond during the investigation. Until then, I suggest you reflect on the oath you took to protect and serve." The room was silent as Harrow stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Elena turned back to the remaining officers. "This is a turning point for our precinct," she said. "If you're willing to work toward rebuilding trust with our community, I welcome you to join me. If not, you're free to leave. But know this, the days of silence and complicity are over." As the officers filed out of the room, Elena felt a glimmer of hope. Change wouldn't come easily, but she was ready for the fight. In the shadows, however, Harrow was already plotting his next move, unwilling to let his powers slip away without a fight. Lines in the sand. Officer Mike Harrow's footsteps echoed sharply in the dim corridor of his apartment building. The suspension papers clenched in his fist felt heavier than they should have. His jaw tightened as the events of the morning replayed in his mind. Alina Patterson had humiliated him in front of everyone, stripping him of his authority. The thought made his blood boil. No one had ever dared to stand up to him like that before. Harrow's apartment was sparse and meticulously organized, a reflection of his need for control. He slammed the door behind him, tossing the suspension papers onto the kitchen counter. Pulling out a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet, he poured himself a generous glass and stared out the window. He wasn't going to let Patterson win, not without a fight. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and smirked. It was Officer Darren Cole, one of his closest allies on the force. Harrow picked up the phone, already anticipating the conversation. "Darren," he said, his tone sharp, "I assume you heard what happened." Cole's voice crackled on the other end. "Yeah, Mike. Everyone's talking about it. Patterson's really shaking things up." Harrow's grip on the glass tightened. "Shaking things up. She's tearing this department apart. She doesn't belong here. None of this would be happening if she didn't have some damn agenda." Cole hesitated. "I hear you, Mike, but maybe it's best to lay low for a while. Let this blow over." "Lay low." Harrow's voice rose. "That woman's out to ruin everything I've built. If we don't stop her now, she'll have this precinct bowing to her every whim." Cole fell silent, sensing the anger bubbling beneath Harrow's words. "We need to remind Patterson who really runs this town," Harrow continued, his voice cold. "And I have a plan." Meanwhile, Alina Patterson was reviewing files late into the evening. Her new office was still bare, but the stacks of reports and folders cluttering her desk made it clear she was already deep into the precinct's history. She had asked Detective Marcus O'Brien to join her for a strategy session, and he arrived with a fresh batch of documents. "Found these in the archives," Marcus said, setting the files down. "Harrow's name comes up a lot, and not just him. There's a pattern of misconduct across the board. Looks like Harrow's been enabling others." Alina sighed. "It's worse than I thought. This isn't just about one bad officer. It's an entire culture." Marcus nodded. "What's the plan?" "Transparency," Alina said firmly. "We're going to release a public statement outlining our findings and our commitment to change. We'll invite community leaders to a town hall. They need to see we're serious about this." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're not worried about backlash?" "Backlash is inevitable," Alina replied. "But we're not here to play it safe. We're here to do what's right." The town hall was scheduled for the following week, and word spread quickly. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, and social media buzzed with anticipation. For some, the event represented hope. For others, it was a threat to the status quo. Grace Patterson watched the preparations with quiet pride. Her granddaughter was stepping into her own, and Grace could see shades of her younger self in Alina's determination. But she also knew the risks. Change always came at a cost. "Be careful, Alina," Grace warned during a visit to the precinct. "When you challenge power, it pushes back." Alina smiled. "I learned from the best. I'll be fine, Grandma." Harrow, meanwhile, was far from idle. He had gathered a small group of loyal officers who shared his resentment toward Alina. They met in secret, venting their frustrations and plotting their next move. "She's making a mockery of everything we've worked for," Harrow said, pacing the room. "But she's underestimating us. She thinks she can waltz in here and change the game. We'll show her she's wrong." One of the officers, a wiry man named Collins, spoke up. "What's the plan, Mike?" Harrow stopped pacing and leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're going to make her look like a failure. Start spreading rumors, stirring up the community against her. And if that doesn't work, well, we'll escalate." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but ultimately nodded in agreement. Harrow's confidence was infectious, and his words carried the weight of someone who had always gotten his way. The night before the town hall, Alina received an anonymous tip. It was a handwritten note slid under her office door. The message was simple but chilling. "You don't belong here. Leave now or face the consequences. Alina stared at the note for a long moment before folding it and placing it in her desk drawer. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. Instead, she called Marcus. "We need to tighten security for the town hall," she said. "I have a feeling things might get tense." Marcus agreed. "I'll handle it. Just focus on your speech." The day of the town hall arrived, and the community center was packed. Residents filled every chair, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. Alina stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you all for coming. My name is Alina Patterson, and I am your new chief of police. I know trust between this department and our community has been strained, but I'm here to change that." She spoke of accountability, transparency, and the need for collaboration. She acknowledged the department's failures and outlined her vision for a better future. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. But as she finished, a man in the back stood up, his face contorted with anger. "What makes you think you can change anything? You're just another outsider who doesn't understand this town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Alina met the man's gaze. "I may be new to this position, but I'm not an outsider. I grew up in this town. My family's roots are here, and I'm committed to making it a better place for all of us." Fractures and alliances. The fallout from the town hall reverberated throughout the community. While some residents left with a renewed sense of hope, others remained skeptical, their trust eroded by years of neglect and misconduct from the precinct. For Alina Patterson, the event was both a step forward and a reminder of the uphill battle she faced. Back at the precinct, tensions were reaching a boiling point. Officers loyal to Harrow whispered in corners, their discontent simmering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, a smaller group of officers, emboldened by Alina's vision, began to step forward. Among them was Detective Marcus O'Brien, who had been working closely with Alina to investigate Harrow's past and dismantle the culture of silence that had protected him. Alina's office had become a hub of activity. Reports, complaints, and evidence against Harrow and his allies piled up on her desk. She had enlisted the help of a civilian oversight board, a move that had further divided the precinct. Some officers saw it as a betrayal, while others viewed it as a necessary step toward accountability. One afternoon, as Alina reviewed yet another stack of files, Marcus entered the office with a grim expression. "We've got a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. Alina looked up. "What now?" Marcus handed her a folder. "Anonymous tips have been coming in. Harrow's been meeting with certain members of the force outside of work hours. They're planning something, but I haven't been able to pinpoint what." Alina's brow furrowed as she flipped through the folder. The reports detailed clandestine meetings, coded messages, and whispers of retaliation. "We can't ignore this," she said firmly. "If they're organizing against us, we need to act before they can follow through." Marcus nodded. "I'll keep digging, but we'll need more than circumstantial evidence if we're going to shut them down." Alina leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "Then we'll hit them with transparency. Let's release the findings from our internal investigation. The public deserves to know what's been happening in this precinct." Marcus hesitated. "That's a risky move. If Harrow's group feels cornered, they might escalate." "Let them," Alina said, her voice steady. "If they want to fight change, they'll have to do it out in the open." The release of the internal investigation's findings sent shockwaves through the community. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the details of Harrow's misconduct and the systemic issues within the precinct. The report highlighted years of abuse, cover-ups, and a failure of leadership to hold officers accountable. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with residents demanding justice and calling for the resignation of officers implicated in the report. For Alina, it was a bittersweet moment. The public's outrage was justified, but it also underscored just how deep the wounds ran. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Harrow's allies grew more vocal in their opposition, openly challenging Elena's authority. Meanwhile, the officers who supported her efforts found themselves caught in a crossfire, their loyalty questioned by both sides. Detective Marcus O'Brien became a target of harassment. Anonymous notes were left on his desk, and his car was vandalized in the precinct's parking lot. Despite the intimidation, he remained steadfast in his support for Elena. "They're trying to scare us into backing down," Marcus said during a late-night meeting with Elena. "But we can't let them win." Elena nodded. "We won't. But we need to be smart about this. If they're resorting to these tactics, it means they're feeling the pressure. That gives us the advantage." Meanwhile, Harrow's group was growing bolder. They began spreading rumors about Elena, painting her as an outsider with an agenda to dismantle the police force. The rumors reached the ears of community members, some of whom began to question Elena's motives. One evening, as Elena prepared to leave the precinct, she found herself confronted by a group of residents outside. Their leader, a middle-aged man named Tom Wilkins, stepped forward. "Chief Patterson," he said, his voice laced with skepticism, "we've heard a lot about what's happening in the precinct. Some folks are saying you're out to destroy our police force. Care to explain?" Elena took a deep breath, meeting Tom's gaze. "I'm not here to destroy anything," she said calmly. "I'm here to rebuild. This precinct has failed this community for too long. My goal is to restore trust and ensure that every officer serves with integrity." Tom crossed his arms. "And what about the good officers? The ones who've been doing their jobs right? Are they just collateral damage?" "Absolutely not," Elena replied. "The good officers are the backbone of this department. They deserve to work in an environment where they're not overshadowed by misconduct. This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability." Tom studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll give you a chance, but you've got a lot to prove." "I understand," Elena said, "and I'm ready to prove it." As the days passed, the divide within the precinct deepened. Harrow's group began holding clandestine meetings off-site, their plans growing more aggressive. They discussed ways to undermine Elena's leadership, from spreading disinformation to staging incidents that would paint her in a negative light. But Elena wasn't without allies. She began reaching out to community leaders, forming partnerships, and building a coalition of support. She knew that true change couldn't come from within the precinct alone. It required the backing of the people. One such ally was Reverend James Carter, a respected figure in the community. He had been a vocal advocate for police reform and saw Elena's leadership as an opportunity to enact meaningful change. "You've got a tough road ahead," Reverend Carter told Elena during a meeting at his church, "but you've got the community behind you. Don't lose sight of that." "I won't," Elena promised. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." The stage was set for a confrontation. Harrow and his allies were determined to hold on to their power, while Elena and her supporters pushed forward with their vision of reform. The fractures within the precinct mirrored the larger struggles of the community, a battle between the old ways and a new future. As Elena prepared for the next phase of her plan, she knew the fight would only get harder. But she also knew that change was never easy, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The breaking point. The precinct's corridors felt more suffocating than ever as the conflict between Elena Patterson and Mike Harrow reached a fever pitch. Whispers turned into outright defiance, and tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded into public view. Each day brought new challenges for Elena as she pushed forward with her reform agenda, despite the mounting resistance both inside and outside the precinct. The protest outside the precinct swelled, fueled by Harrow's group's disinformation campaign. Posters and online posts labeled Elena as a destabilizing force, an outsider with a vendetta against the police. Some residents who had initially supported her began to waver, their faith shaken by the relentless smear tactics. But Elena remained undeterred, her resolve steeled by the community leaders and officers who still stood by her. Inside the precinct, Detective Marcus O'Brien was working overtime to uncover Harrow's plans. He had grown wary of every interaction, knowing that the walls had ears and trust was a scarce commodity. Late one evening, Marcus sat in his dimly lit office, combing through surveillance footage and anonymous tips when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Parking lot. Midnight. Come alone. Marcus's stomach tightened. The cryptic message was likely a trap, but it could also be the breakthrough they needed. After a moment's hesitation, he forwarded the message to Elena with a note. I'm going. Keep your phone on. At midnight, Marcus stepped into the shadowy precinct parking lot. The air was heavy with tension, and the faint hum of streetlights provided the only sound. A figure emerged from the darkness, cloaked in a hoodie that obscured their face. You O'Brien? The figure asked, their voice low and hurried. Marcus nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his side. Who are you? The figure glanced around nervously before speaking. Someone who wants to see Harrow taken down. I've got proof of what he's planning, but you've got to act fast. They handed Marcus a USB drive before disappearing into the night without another word. Marcus's heart raced as he returned to his office, plugging the drive into his computer. What he saw made his blood run cold. The next morning, Elena sat across from Marcus in her office as he explained what he had found. The USB drive contained documents and audio recordings detailing a coordinated effort by Harrow's group to undermine her leadership. But worse than that, it revealed plans for a staged incident, a fabricated emergency that would escalate into violence and discredit Elena entirely. They're planning to set up a confrontation during a community event next week, Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency. They're going to make it look like you've lost control of the department. Elena's face hardened. If they're willing to go this far, they've already lost control themselves. We need to stop this before it happens. How? Marcus asked. If we move too soon, we risk tipping them off. But if we wait too long, they'll go through with it. Elena thought for a moment before speaking. We let them think they're in control. We'll use the evidence to set a trap of our own. And when the time comes, we'll expose them in front of the community. The days leading up to the event were a whirlwind of preparation. Elena worked tirelessly to coordinate with trusted officers and community leaders, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Meanwhile, Harrow and his group moved forward with their plans, unaware that their actions were being closely monitored. The event itself was a community fair, organized to bring residents and law enforcement together. Food stalls, live music, and games filled the park, creating an atmosphere of celebration that belied the undercurrents of tension. Elena mingled with attendees, her presence a mix of reassurance and vigilance. From a distance, Harrow watched with narrowed eyes. His plan was in motion, and he was confident that by the end of the day, Elena's career would be in ruins. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. A group of Harrow's allies, dressed in plain clothes, began to stir up trouble among the crowd. They shouted inflammatory remarks, pushing and shoving attendees to create chaos. As planned, a call was made to the precinct, reporting a rioting crowd at the event. Elena, who had anticipated this move, signaled Marcus and her team. They moved swiftly, diffusing tensions and documenting the actions of Harrow's group. Hidden cameras captured everything. From the instigators' actions to the staged evidence, they planted to incriminate Elena. When uniformed officers arrived, Harrow stepped forward, ready to take command of the situation. But before he could speak, Elena intercepted him. "Officer Harrow," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "You've gone too far." Harrow smirked. "I'm here to restore order, Chief. Clearly, you've lost control." Elena held up a tablet, displaying live footage from the hidden cameras. The crowd fell silent as the recordings played, revealing Harrow's group orchestrating the chaos. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the attendees as the truth became clear. "This is your idea of order," Elena demanded. "Inciting violence, endangering civilians. You've betrayed the very principles you swore to uphold." Harrow's smirk faltered as officers moved to arrest him and his accomplices. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers as the instigators were led away in handcuffs. Alina stood tall, her voice steady, as she addressed the onlookers. "This is not the end," she said. "It's the beginning of a new chapter for our community. Together, we will rebuild trust and create a department that serves everyone with dignity and respect." That night, as the precinct quieted down, Alina sat alone in her office. The battle had been hard-fought, and the road ahead would be no less challenging. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of relief. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. A new dawn. The aftermath of the community event sent ripples through the precinct, the town, and beyond. News outlets captured the dramatic exposure of Mike Harrow and his co-conspirators, and videos of Alina Patterson's decisive actions circulated widely on social media. For the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in her favor, but she knew the hardest work was still ahead. The precinct's break room was unusually quiet the next morning. Officers who had once whispered in defiance now avoided Alina's gaze. Harrow's arrest had sent shockwaves through the ranks, and many were left grappling with the realization that the old ways were no longer safe. Detective Marcus O'Brien entered the room, a folder in his hand and a rare grin on his face. "Morning, Chief," he said, handing her the folder. "Finalized statements from last night. We've got enough to ensure Harrow and his group won't be seeing daylight for a long time." Alina flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. "Good work, Marcus. But this isn't just about locking them up. We have to rebuild everything they've broken." Marcus nodded. "I'm with you every step of the way. What's next?" "Accountability," Alina replied. "We'll conduct a full audit of the precinct from top to bottom. Everyone's conduct will be reviewed, and those who don't meet the standards will be removed." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of officers." "Then we'll hire new ones," Alina said firmly. "This department will be a beacon of integrity, no matter how long it takes." Over the next few weeks, the precinct underwent a transformation. Officers were required to attend ethics training sessions, and Alina brought in external consultants to assist with the review process. Community leaders like Reverend James Carter and Grace Patterson were invited to participate, ensuring transparency and fostering trust between the department and the people it served. Alina's reforms extended beyond the precinct. She implemented new community policing initiatives, assigning officers to work closely with residents and local organizations. These programs aimed to break down the barriers that had long divided the police from the people they were meant to protect. Despite the progress, resistance remained. A faction of officers still clung to the belief that Alina's changes were unnecessary and disruptive. Their murmurs of dissent grew quieter with each passing day, but Alina knew the fight wasn't over. One evening, as she prepared to leave her office, Alina received an unexpected visitor. Tom Wilkins, the skeptical community member who had confronted her at the town hall, stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Chief Patterson," he said, his voice softer than before. "Got a minute?" Alina gestured for him to sit. "Of course, Mr. Wilkins. What's on your mind?" Tom settled into the chair, his eyes darting around the room before meeting hers. "I came to apologize. I didn't trust you when you first came here. Thought you were just another politician making promises. But after what I saw at the fair, I was wrong." Alina smiled, her expression warm but resolute. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wilkins. Change isn't easy, and I understand why people were skeptical. But this isn't about me. It's about all of us working together." Tom nodded. "If there's anything I can do to help, just say the word." "There is something," Alina said. "Spread the word. Let people know what we're trying to build here. The more support we have, the stronger we'll be." Meanwhile, Harrow's trial loomed large over the town. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his former allies had begun to turn on him in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial became a public spectacle, with residents packing the courthouse to witness justice being served. Alina testified during the proceedings, her testimony painting a vivid picture of the corruption and abuse that had festered within the precinct. Her words carried the weight of her experiences, and by the end of the trial, there was no doubt about Harrow's guilt. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his career and reputation in ruins. With Harrow behind bars, the precinct began to heal. Officers who had once been hesitant to embrace Alina's vision now found themselves inspired by her leadership. New recruits joined the force, bringing fresh perspectives and a renewed sense of purpose. The community's trust, though still fragile, began to grow stronger. Grace Patterson watched these changes with pride, her granddaughter's accomplishments a testament to the strength and resilience she had always believed in. One evening, as the two women sat together on Grace's porch, Alina reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "I couldn't have done this without you, Grandma," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've always been my inspiration." Grace chuckled softly. "You've always had the fire, Alina. I just reminded you to keep it burning." The two women sat in companionable silence, the hum of cicadas filling the night air. For the first time in months, Alina felt a sense of peace. The fight for justice was far from over, but for now she could take comfort in the progress they had made. The precinct's transformation became a model for other towns facing similar challenges. Alina's leadership drew attention from state and national officials, who sought her advice on implementing reforms in their own departments. Though the work was demanding, Alina embraced it, knowing that every step forward was a victory for justice. As she stood in her office one morning, gazing out the window at the bustling precinct below, Alina allowed herself a small smile. The journey had been long and arduous, but she had proven that change was possible. And in the quiet moments, when doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the words her grandmother had always told her. "Justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you fight for."